Okay, welcome to part two. You've now had a time to think about what are the entity, resources, and events. And remember, resources or servers are the same thing here. And let's see. Okay, so the entity here are the customers arriving following a Poisson process at a rate of 48 customers per hour. Recall from probability what this means is that the inter-arrival time of customers is exponential with rate 48, okay? Which means the mean is 1 over 48 hours. The resources or server are the pharmacist. They're the person that processes the customer. And the events are customer arrivals and customer departures. Remember how we talked about in the hand simulation, there's also the dummy events of initialization and termination of the simulation, i.e. the end of the time horizon. Okay, the process that we go through is we have an entity, then the entities arrive, they are processed, and they leave the system. We put this here because we're going to actually have an object that represents a kind of an entity. Okay, so within what we're going to see in Simio is entity. This step is going to be represented by a model entity object. The arrival will be modeled by what's called a source object. We'll have a line drawn to the server, and then finally they leave the system into what's called a sync object. Okay, so the first thing we're going to create is our model entity object. That looks like this little sideways isosceles triangle, and we're going to change that so that instead of named default entity, we'll just call it customer. It's not really required to run, but it's going to be helpful for us to visualize the simulation. And we're going to see with more complicated simulations, the entity types are going to be important. Okay. We're going to have our source. This is a different kind of object. You can see it looks like a dashed arrow. It's going to have in that right-hand side of the screen, it has, when we click on it, it has these kinds of properties. You can see that it has an inter-arrival time, right? That's going to be random at dot exponential, remember, because it the arrivals follow a Poisson process. The entity type, we're going to have to make sure that that matches the name of the entity the entity object that we used. And its purpose, remember, it's to generate entity arrivals. So that's really where the arrivals come from. Okay. So the time offset, this is the difference between the start of the simulation and the time of the first arrival. So we can actually we can have a system start and not have arrivals come right at first. The inter-arrival time in the units, of course, that defines the kind of process that our arrivals are following. And then we could have bursts of arrivals. We only have one customer arriving at a single time, but there are models where you might have more arrivals occurring per arrival event. Okay. So remember, customers arrive following a Poisson process at a rate of 48 customers per hour. So we're going to have to change the inter-arrival time for this to work. Remember, we have 48 customers per arrival. 48 customers per hour. So this means that we need this random, as I said before, we need an exponential. Okay, and at 48 customers per hour, well, we have to take the inverse of that. so that we get, so you take 60 minutes divided by 48, and you get 1.25 minutes per customer, and that's the inter-arrival time. Okay, so that's the rate. We need to take 1 hour divided by that rate. If we want to keep it in minutes, it's 60 minutes divided by 48, and that's 1.25. So we change this to 1.25. So I hope it's clear. What you should have on your screen right now in that big field is you should have an entity object, and now you should also have a source object. And the source object should be changed into the properties field on the far right of your screen so that it looks like this. Okay. And this entity type should be called customer, because remember we changed the name of the entity object to customer. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to that slide so you make sure that you've done that. Yes, so just if you click in this default entity, make sure that that's title there is changed to customer. Okay. Okay, so the penultimate object we're going to create is called a server object that looks like this. Okay, when you put it out onto the screen, you can click on it and you can see it should have all of these properties on the far right hand side. Okay, the capacity is going to be either fixed or based on some sort of work schedule for us. So you might think about the server. The idea of it being on a work schedule means that maybe we, there might be 2 pharmacists working at one point in time, and 3 at another time, and only 1 at a less busy time. For us, of course, we're going to keep it fixed at 1. Okay. Then that's that initial capacity there. We'll just leave that 1. We're going to use a first in, first out system for our entity. In other words, it's sort of the normal way that queues work. If you think about it in real life, if you're first there, then you get served first. But you can think there's other ways that entities could get processed, in particular from the first day of class. If you have a triage order, that if you think about what happens subsequent to being triaged, then patients are treated in triage order. So there might be some value that they're assigned. Okay. The time required, within Simio, we can build in transfer times. So if you think about it, in our models, we've sort of assumed that entities instantaneously appear at each step, but of course that's not realistic, and so as you can actually start simulating, there's actually some time to walk or to move the entity from one area to another. Okay, finally we get to processing time. And remember, for our model, we had this detail in the description. The time to retrieve a customer's medication and complete the checkout process was exponential with a mean of 1 minute. So we look at this processing time in its units. It is indeed minutes, so that's good. And then we have to change this by clicking on it and choosing from the drop-down menu random.exponential. And in the parentheses, we have to type 1 for the mean of 1 minute. Once they're processed, they have to go to a sync node. Again, there might be a transfer time. You can see this has details. So grab a sync node from the far left column, drag it out onto the screen. So now you should have, in your screen, you should have the entity object. You should have a source. You should have a server. And now you should drag a sync object. Okay, and you can kind of just drag them across so that they hook up. You don't need to do anything with the entity object, it just sits there. Okay. So we don't have any transfer time here, but you can actually have that as well for the same reason I mentioned before. For sync there's not very many properties to change here. It just represents the exit. So we have all the, here's what your diagram should look like. It should have all these 4 objects as I drew before. This has, of course, a more accurate depiction of what these objects look like in your program. Make sure that you have these lines connecting everything. This represents the flow in the model, how the entities arrive. They arrive at the source. They arrive from the source object, which we called customer arrival. We changed the name, that we can change the name of that so that it's more reflective of what it is. We have a service object. We could change that to pharmacist if we wished. And here's the exit. Okay. Now we're ready to run the model. So if you click on up here, so the end time, if you click on that box, you can, instead of having it be a clock time, you can have it run just for 10 hours per day. Okay. So you go ahead and change that to run length and change it to 10 hours. And that's going to be the time horizon of our simulation. The speed factor, go ahead and change that up. We want that to be high so that we don't actually have to wait 10 hours. If we just let it at 1, it would take 10 full hours. It would slow down the simulation so it runs in 10 hours. Of course, we want it to be faster than that so we can actually see the results in a timely manner. So you can go ahead and change that speed factor, click in this box, and change it to 50. Okay. Now everything is going, and you can hit run. So right now it's on pause, but if you think about it, if you click this run button, it'll look like this, and it'll start running. You can see this frame is from a snapshot taken when it was almost close to being finished. It'll run quite quickly if you have the multiplier at 50. Now if you click on the results tab, you can see that we have all the results of the model here. And from here you can start to see, and just take a look at all this, you can start to see all the different entity level and system level statistics that we have. And we'll talk about that more in the future.